They cut down my grandfather's 87-year-old orchard while I was away, but they missed one buried stone, and it cost them $410,000. If you love watching corrupt HOAs get destroyed in court, subscribe now. This one's insane. They didn't just cut down a few trees, they erased 87 years of my family's history while I was on a business trip, and they didn't think anyone would notice. 42 apple trees, planted by my grandfather in 1939, gone in a single afternoon. But they made one mistake, a tiny buried mistake made of granite, and it just cost them $410,000. If you think you've seen HOA corruption before, wait until you see what was hiding underground. Subscribe now because this story only gets more unbelievable from here. I was in Denver for a 3-day conference when my neighbor called me, her voice shaking. "You need to come home," she said. "They're cutting down your grandfather's trees." I remember laughing at first, thinking she was exaggerating. Nobody touches a private orchard without permission. Nobody. I was wrong. By the time I got back, 6 hours of driving that felt like 6 years, the damage was already done. 42 apple and pear trees, planted by my grandfather in 1939 when he first cleared that land by hand, were reduced to stumps and wood chips. Some of those trees were older than the HOA itself. I stood in what used to be a living orchard and felt something in my chest cave in. The HOA's justification? A newly appointed board president named Randall Cobb had declared the orchard an unmaintained eyesore violating community landscaping standards, despite the fact that my orchard sat on my own 2 acres, entirely outside any shared HOA-maintained property. He didn't ask. He didn't warn me. He hired a landscaping crew, cited a vague clause buried in a decades-old HOA bylaw nobody had enforced in 20 years, and had my family's legacy chainsawed into mulch while I was 3 states away. When I confronted him, he barely blinked. "The board voted unanimously," he said. "Community aesthetics matter. You should thank us." Thank him, Fidesz, destroying 87 years of my grandfather's work. I wanted to scream. Instead, I did something smarter. I walked the property line myself, inch by inch, looking for anything, any shred of evidence that could prove this was more than just an aesthetic dispute. That's when my boot struck something hard, buried just beneath the surface near the orchard's northern edge. A stone, old, weathered, and half sunk into the earth, with markings that would turn this entire nightmare upside down. I knelt down and brushed away 80 years of dirt and moss with my bare hands. Carved into the stone's face were faint but unmistakable letters, a surveyor's mark, a date, 1939, and a set of coordinates. My heart started pounding before I even understood why. I took photos from every angle and called my cousin, Priya, a licensed land surveyor, who'd been begging me for years to get the property properly resurveyed. When I sent her the images, her response came almost instantly. "Don't touch anything else," she said. "That's an original benchmark stone. If it's what I think it is, this changes everything." 2 days later, Priya arrived with survey equipment, GPS mapping tools, and an expression I'd never seen on her before, somewhere between excitement and disbelief. She spent 6 hours cross-referencing the stone's coordinates against the county's historical land records. When she finally sat me down at my kitchen table, her hands were trembling slightly as she spread out an old plat map dated 1939, the same year my grandfather planted his first tree. "Your grandfather's original property line," she said, "isn't where the current HOA boundary map says it is." I stared at her, confused. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said slowly, "that stone marks the true legal boundary, and it's 14 feet further into what the HOA has been treating as community common area for the last 2 decades. My stomach dropped. "So they've been mowing, maintaining, claiming land that's actually mine?" "Not just that," Priya said, pulling out another document, this one newer, dated just 8 months ago. "This is the HOA's updated site plan, the one they used to justify cutting your orchard. And according to this 1939 benchmark, Roughly a third of your orchard they destroyed wasn't just yours. It was land they had zero legal claim to touch, HOA bylaws or not. I felt something shift in my chest, grief turning into something colder, sharper. Focus. There's more, Priya added quietly, opening her laptop. I cross-checked the HOA's landscaping contractor's invoice with the county's tree preservation ordinance. Randall Cobb didn't just violate your property rights. She turned the screen toward me. He may have just violated a state environmental protection statute, one with penalties calculated per tree, per year of estimated age. I did the math in my head. 42 trees, some over 80 years old. The number that came back made me sit down. The number Priya calculated made the room feel smaller, an estimated $410,000 in potential penalties, restitution and legal damages. If the county's tree preservation ordinance applied the way she thought it did. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying Randall Cobb's smug voice in my head. You should thank us. The next morning, I called an attorney named Elena Vasquez, who specialized in property boundary disputes and environmental law, a rare combination, but exactly what this case needed. I sent her everything, the photos of the stone, Priya's survey findings, the HOA's landscaping invoice, and the 1939 plat map. Her response was immediate. Don't speak to the HOA again, not one word. I'm filing an emergency preservation of evidence request before they realize what they've actually done. 3 days later, Randall Cobb showed up at my door, not with an apology, but with a folder of his own, wearing the same self-satisfied expression he'd had while defending the chainsaws. I heard you've been talking to lawyers, he said. Let's be reasonable. The board is willing to offer you $15,000 for the inconvenience. Consider it a goodwill gesture. $15,000 for 87 years of history, for a discovery that could be worth nearly 30 times that amount. I almost laughed in his face. Almost. Instead, I said calmly, I'll have my attorney reach out. His confidence flickered, just slightly, like a man who suddenly wasn't sure if he was still winning. That flicker told me everything. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know how wrong yet. 2 weeks later, Elena filed a full civil complaint. Trespass, destruction of property, violation of the state's Heritage Tree Preservation Act, and a formal boundary dispute backed by Priya's certified survey. The HOA's insurance company got involved. Their attorney requested an emergency meeting. And Randall Cobb, according to a neighbor who still sat on the board, started missing HOA meetings entirely. But the real gut punch came 3 weeks later, when Elena called me with a tone I hadn't heard from her before, careful, almost hesitant. There's something in the county archives you need to see, she said. It's not just about the boundary anymore. What is it? It's a letter, she said, written by the original HOA founder in 1962, and it mentions your grandfather by name. Elena emailed me the scanned letter that same afternoon. My hands were shaking as I opened it. It was written by Harold Whitfield, the man who founded the HOA in 1962, 23 years after my grandfather planted that orchard. The letter was addressed to the county recorder's office, and it wasn't just administrative correspondence. It was an apology. Whitfield had written that during the HOA's original formation, a boundary survey had been informally adjusted to give the new community a more usable common green space, and he explicitly acknowledged that this adjustment quietly absorbed a strip of land belonging to the Hendricks Orchard property, my grandfather's land, without ever formally notifying him or amending legal records. He'd known. The HOA's own founder had known for over 60 years that a chunk of my family's land had been unlawfully folded into the community's common area, and instead of fixing it, he buried the truth in a letter that sat forgotten in a county archive. This isn't just negligence anymore, Eleanor told me on the phone, her voice tight with controlled anger. This is a documented decades-long cover-up. and Randall Cobb's landscaping crew just destroyed the one piece of physical evidence, that boundary stone, that could have made this dispute go away quietly. Except it didn't disappear, because I found it first. 3 months later, we stood in a county courtroom. Randall Cobb sat beside the HOA's attorney, visibly thinner, visibly rattled. Pear's certified survey, the 1939 benchmark stone photographs, the Heritage Tree Preservation Act violations, and Whitfield's 60-year-old confession letter were all laid out before Judge Marcus Ellery, a man known for his zero-tolerance stance on property rights violations. When the judge finished reviewing everything, he looked directly at Randall Cobb. "Mr. Cobb," he said, "you destroyed 42 heritage trees on land your own HOA's internal records prove was never rightfully yours to maintain, let alone destroy. This court finds in full favor of the plaintiff." The final judgment: $410,000 in combined damages, environmental restitution, boundary trespass penalties, and punitive damages for willful destruction of protected heritage trees. Randall Cobb resigned within the week. The HOA's insurance carrier paid the settlement in full, terrified of what a public trial might do to every other property line they'd quietly adjusted over the decades. As for the land, Pear's survey became the new legal record. My grandfather's true property line was finally restored, 63 years after Harold Whitfield first tried to erase it. I replanted that orchard the following spring. 42 new saplings, one for every tree they cut down. And right at the northern edge, protected now by a small iron fence, sits the same weathered granite stone that started it all. The tiny piece of 1939 history that an HOA thought nobody would ever find. They tried to bulldoze my family's legacy into silence. Instead, they dug up the one thing that made sure the truth could never be buried again. If this story kept you hooked until the very end, imagine what other secrets are buried under HOA common areas everywhere. Subscribe now, because the next discovery might be even bigger than $410,000.